Welcome back to another explainer. Today we're unpacking something absolutely fascinating. We are diving into a deep piece of historical and economic research, specifically a master's dissertation by Michael James Coombs from the University of Pretoria. It's titled The Socio-Economic Impact of the Pax Romana and Augustus's Policy Reforms on the Roman Provinces. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but it is this incredible deep dive into how one of history's most famous figures totally transformed the ancient world. And honestly, the way he pulled it off is going to surprise you. So here's the central mystery we're unraveling today. How exactly does a military dictator accidentally create an economic miracle? Think about it. Augustus Caesar kicked off his reign by conquering more territory than anyone before or after him. The guy was a military dictator, right? He was fundamentally driven by power and control. Yet somehow, he sparked this era of just unprecedented economic prosperity and growth across the entire Roman Empire. And the massive irony here, he didn't even do it on purpose. As Coombs points out in the research, this whole economic boom was basically a giant accidental byproduct of a conqueror who just realized he couldn't sustain any more conquests. He literally had to stop expanding and just start managing what he had. To understand this accidental economic miracle, we're going to walk through 5 key areas today. First, the accidental piece. Second, the agricultural shift. Third, fixing corrupt tax systems. Fourth, roads, troops, and stability. And finally, ancient lessons for modern Africa. All right, let's jump right in.
Section 1. The accidental piece.
Okay, let's dive into this. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace. We hear this term thrown around all the time, right? Like Augustus had this grand, beautiful humanitarian vision for a peaceful utopia. But the source material makes it crystal clear. A policy of endless conquest just wasn't feasible anymore. Peace wasn't some noble end goal. It was a strictly practical military necessity. The empire had just grown way too large, way too fast. Augustus had to consolidate. But here's the magic. Just by putting a stop to the constant wars and civil strife that had totally crippled the Republic, Augustus unintentionally created the perfect, stable conditions for economic unification. It turns out prosperity really just needed a quiet room to grow in. Moving to Section 2, the agricultural shift. So what actually happens when you suddenly have peace? Well, to get that, we have to look at how the elite Roman mind worked. For the wealthy upper classes, agriculture was pretty much the only quote-unquote proper and virtuous way to make money, and they needed a ton of it to fund their lavish lifestyles. So they created these massive estates called latifundia. With this new peace in place, wealthy Romans felt super confident. They started looking out at the newly conquered, underdeveloped western provinces, places like Gaul and Spain, and they aggressively bought up the land. They pushed local peasant farmers out and staffed these giant megafarms with slave labor. But here is where the unintended consequences kick in again, and it's just a brilliant economic domino effect. Step 1, the Pax Romana brings peace. That means suppressing piracy, banditry, and crucially, foreign wars. Step 2, because wars and border raids were the main source of slaves, the slave supply suddenly just crashes. There literally aren't enough slaves to run these massive latifundia. Step 3, the wealthy landowners panic. They're sitting on these huge tracts of land with nobody to work them. So what do? They're forced to pivot. They actually have to hire the exact same local peasant farmers they originally displaced, bringing them back on as tenant farmers. Just think about that ripple effect. Because the wars stopped, rural peasants accidentally got a pathway right back to their livelihoods. Section 3. Fixing corrupt tax systems. Now, having a job doesn't mean a whole lot if the government is just stealing all your money, right? Under the old Roman Republic, the provincial tax system was an absolute nightmare. It was supposedly this fair system where farmers agreed on a tithe, a pectio, with tax collectors. But oh man, it became wildly corrupted. The tax collection rights were sold off in massive blocks to these wealthy financiers known as the publicani. Honestly, these guys were practically a mafia. They had immense political influence, they completely controlled the extortion courts, and provincial governors were terrified of them. So the publicani would just demand these grossly exaggerated taxes from local farmers, essentially bankrupting them.
Augustus looked at this and recognized pretty quickly that this was entirely unsustainable if he wanted a stable empire. So he just completely scrapped the use of the publicani for direct taxes. He took this chaotic, extortionary shakedown and replaced it with a fair, standardized system that applied uniformly across the entire empire. He basically stripped the power away from these greedy middlemen and put the whole thing under strict, predictable imperial oversight.
Let's actually look at how this breaks down into the numbers.
Augustus introduced predictable fixed taxes. You had the tributum soli, which was a wealth tax, usually just a flat 1% per year on land and assets. He brought in the tributum capitis, a basic poll tax for adults, and he even taxed Roman citizens with a 5% inheritance tax just to balance the scales out. The socio-economic impact of this was absolutely profound. Because the taxes were now this predictable, cash-based system, local provincial farmers could finally actually plan ahead. If a bad drought hit, they weren't suddenly at the mercy of loan sharks and extortionists. They could weather the storm without losing their farms. And that kept the rural economy incredibly stable.
Section 4. Roads, Troops, and Stability. With peace established, agriculture shifting, and taxes formalized, we start seeing the incredible, unintended economic benefits of military logistics. In the old days, Roman armies just roamed around, conquering everything in sight. But under Augustus, because expansion stopped, he had to permanently station his legions in the provinces just to defend the borders. Now, if you have thousands of permanent troops just sitting in a province, you've got to supply them. So Augustus builds these massive, interlinking road networks. He establishes the cursus publicus, which was the imperial postal system. What he was trying to do was build a military supply chain, but what he actually ended up creating was the greatest trade infrastructure the ancient world had ever seen. And this brilliantly illustrates the core dynamic of the Augustan boom. Think about it. You have permanent troops, which means absolute security. You have brand new roads, which means incredibly easy transportation. Suddenly, a military garrison essentially becomes this massive consumer market. Local economies rapidly industrialize just to supply the troops with basic stuff: food, leather, iron. Wealthy elites back in Rome saw all this security and infrastructure, and they just poured investment money right into the provinces. Purely military decisions accidentally created the absolute perfect environment for an economic explosion.
Section 5. Ancient Lessons for Modern Africa.
This brings us to the final and maybe the most compelling section of Coombs's research, applying these 2,000-year-old blueprints to the modern world, specifically to developing regions in Africa. He includes this quote, "Peace as the first imperative. It is hoped that such a study might present a better understanding of how simple measures in peace could lift these areas out of dire poverty." The author is making a really profound connection here. A lot of underdeveloped areas today are crippled by instability and conflict, which is actually very similar to the tribal Roman provinces right before they were incorporated. The overarching thesis of this research is that peace, even an imposed, purely practical peace, is the absolute non-negotiable first imperative. Without the Pax Romana, none of the infrastructure, none of the agricultural shifts, and absolutely none of the tax reforms would have even mattered. Peace is the foundational prerequisite that allows simple administrative measures to actually take root and lift populations out of poverty. So, the crucial point we are left with is this: the actual mechanics of economic growth haven't fundamentally changed in 2 millennia. Predictable taxation, basic infrastructure, and above all, security from violence, these are still the bedrock of prosperity. As you look at the developing world today, or even the economic policies in your own country, think about Augustus. How do you see these ancient Roman policies reflecting in the successes or struggles of today's global economy? Think about how stability and clear rules of the game can spark immense growth, even if that growth is just a happy accident. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this dive into the Roman economy has given you a fresh lens to view our modern world.